I think I have experienced this sense of not being remembered, not being recognized my entire career. But I think it was most relevant being a restaurant critic because everyone has that perception of the critic that goes into a restaurant anonymous. And there are so many stories that people laugh about when they hear that restaurant critics have had to go in disguise just for the sake of trying to stay under the radar. But for me, what I noticed, and it was interesting, I'd go to restaurants and people wouldn't recognize me. The chefs who I had met and interviewed several times in person, presented awards to them, I'd still walk into the room and they had no idea who I was.
Welcome to the Local News Matters podcast, where we explore pathways to stronger journalism, better businesses, and healthier communities. I'm Tim Mergen-Porter, CEO of the Colorado Press Association. And in each episode, I sit down with guests from newsrooms and others in the local news ecosystem to highlight the innovative work of local newsrooms and those that support them, as well as the crucial questions they face. This episode, I'm dropping an episode of the Journalism Salute podcast from Mark Simon. Mark describes the podcast as a journalism appreciation podcast. His interviews with a diverse cast of working journalists are nice complements to the interviews Local News Matters does on the newsrooms and support systems that enable that work. I encourage you to follow the Journalism Salute in your favorite podcast app, visit their website at thejournalismsalute.org, and follow them on Twitter or X at JournalismPod. To never miss an episode of Local News Matters, sign up for our newsletter at lnmpod.com. And now I bring you the Journalism Salute's interview with Lyndsay C. Green, the Pulitzer finalist dining and restaurant critic for the Detroit Free Press.
On this episode, we're joined by Lyndsay C. Green. Lyndsay is a restaurant critic for the Detroit Free Press. This past year, she was a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize for Criticism for a body of work described thusly by her employer: eye-opening, thought-provoking, mouthwatering. Lyndsay's work brings fresh perspective and uncommon courage to readers hungry for brave dining criticism. She taps into Detroit's culturally expansive and unpretentious spirit as she reviews area eateries. She's also won an award as an emerging voice from the Beard Foundation, and her work can be seen in the book celebrating the year's best food writing. When she's not reviewing the cooking of others, she's growing her own food and developing recipes. And she's had a whole other career as a beauty editor. That might be the longest intro I've done. Hi, Lyndsay.
Hi, thank you for having me.
So explain, out of all of that, what your journalism origin story is.
Sure. Well, where do I start? So I went to Penn State. I graduated from Penn State. I studied print journalism. I actually did a double major in journalism and international studies. And so my intention was always to get into journalism. I originally really wanted to be in magazines and women's magazines, and that's ultimately where I ended up. My first job was at Ebony magazine and started in the beauty and style department. So I really kicked off my career doing exactly what I thought I would always be doing. And then it evolved over time. And so I moved from magazine to magazine. I did some freelancing where I wrote for several different publications. And eventually when I moved to Detroit, I found myself at a local magazine. It was called Our Detroit. I was the managing editor there. And eventually that's sort of where I kind of got my food bug and started a position as a dining and restaurant critic, or I'm sorry, my title there was actually just dining editor. And I managed the food section for Hour from month to month. And that was right before COVID started. So, the way that I covered food changed pretty quickly there. And now I'm at the Free Press. That's kind of a nutshell, but that's kind of it.
That's a good synopsis. Is there anything in your heritage, family, childhood background that would have lent itself to writing, storytelling, critiquing, eating? Any of those?
Eating for sure. I think we were big, big eaters in my family. I haven't really thought about that. I think my mom was a really great writer, and she wasn't, not any sort of formalized writing, but she just had a beautiful way with words. I remember she'd write really amazing cards, for all of the holidays and birthdays. She and I started a journal together. We had this plan to write a book together, and so she would write a chapter, and then I would try and pick up where she left off and write another chapter. And we didn't get very far. I think we might have gotten two or three chapters, maybe, but I just remember she had such a beautiful way with words and also just really great penmanship too.
Sounds like it got passed down to you. Could younger Lyndsay have ever imagined winning a Pulitzer or being a finalist?
Right, right. Well, I have to say, I think she could have. I think that I have always been such a dreamer that I think as a kid, I definitely probably envisioned, Pulitzers. And, when I thought about going into magazines, I dreamt of being the editor-in-chief of a magazine, being the next Anna Wintour. So I think younger Lyndsay had big dreams. And so she probably did have that in her plan. And it wasn't until she got older that she maybe started to dim that light a little bit. But yeah, I think as a kid, I might have seen it.
And just to add some perspective here, you're Afro-Latina, right?
I am. So my mom is Puerto Rican and my dad is Black.
You worked, as you mentioned, at Ebony, Glamour, and Teen Vogue for 2 years each. This kind of all leading up to what you're doing now. What was your biggest takeaway, either on a broad kind of perspective or specific to each of those, in terms of working for such prominent publications?
I I was at each of those for about 2 years, except Teen Vogue. I was only there for about a year. And also in my role at the Free Press, I've actually only been in that role for about a year and a half now. But what I think when I look back on my career and all of the publications that I've worked at, I really think that I was able to take something different from each of those experiences that really contributed to the larger picture of being a journalist. So, when I think back at Teen Vogue, my role was digital beauty editor. So I really gained a lot of experience learning about SEO and social media and, everything that it takes to be online these days. And when I think about Glamour, so I was specifically at Glam Belleza Latina was the name of the magazine that I worked at, and it was produced out of Glamour magazine's beauty department. And so it was a quarterly publication. And I think with that, again, really was able to focus specifically on beauty and also for a target audience being the Latin community. But I was able to really work very closely with the beauty department and very closely with Cindy Levy, who at the time was Glamour's editor-in-chief. And so I learned a lot, up close and personal for, what it takes to produce a magazine. And then at Ebony, I'm going backwards here, but at Ebony, I was Elaine Walteroth's assistant. So, I don't know if you're familiar with Elaine, but she's sort of a celebrity these days. She's a, New York Times bestselling author. She is a host on Project Runway. She's become this big media personality. She also was the editor-in-chief at Teen Vogue. And so being so close to, I was her assistant, so we worked together in a really small office, really shared an office, and it was almost like working with family. So I think being able to learn from someone who is just such a hard worker and who just inherently has really amazing journalism skills, I think I take that with me, and I will take it with me, I think, for the rest of my career.
Sounds like you had great mentors.
Yeah, for sure.
What's Beauty Atlas?
So Beauty Atlas was my magazine. It is a digital beauty magazine. My goal, even when I was in college, which is sort of why I double majored in journalism and international studies, was that I wanted to eventually be the beauty director of a travel magazine or an international magazine and really focus on beauty and fashion and sort of women's lifestyle subjects from a cultural or an international perspective. And that position just didn't exist. And I don't even think it exists to this day. So my goal with Beauty Atlas was to create that position. And so I wanted to travel to other countries and really explore their beauty scenes, talk to women of different cultures and try and understand their beauty ideals. And so I did that with Beauty Atlas. I published 3 issues. My first issue was Bali, the second one was Cuba or Havana, and the third issue was Chicago, which is where I was living at the time and just wanted to explore my own, neighborhood. Um, and I really just did a deep dive into, like I said, beauty rituals. I was able to tour, spas and salons and nail salons and just get a really intimate understanding of women and their sort of, like I said, beauty ideals.
I love the idea of essentially speak the position into existence,
Yeah,
which
yeah.
that's been a good theme on these episodes recently. So I presume that's a point of advice that I would presume people can take from this.
Definitely. And I also just think that we can, you can create whatever it is you want to create, especially in such a digital age. Like I said, Beauty Atlas was a digital publication. Eventually it went on to win an award in London at the Digital Magazine Awards. It was the what was the title? It was Launch of the Year, I believe it was. And so, I think we can get creative. You can really, I think I grew up in a time where they said, you have to choose beauty or fashion. You have to choose, once you're on the beauty path, you can't turn out of that. And I think we're in an era of second lives, right? And pivots and you can make whatever you want. So I think I'm really an advocate for just saying, follow your interests and your talents and see where it lands.
That's great. So on the About page on your personal website, there's a picture of you making a salad, and I would describe the expression on your face as that of joy. You wrote, "Food has always been my comfort and an art form that I draw great inspiration from. It's the passageway into every culture, the bridge to every locale." What was the bridge for you from beauty writing to food writing?
Oh, that's interesting. Well, I thought back about when I was traveling for Beauty Atlas and just when I travel in general, I realized that I was, doing some things that were really for work and some things that I was just doing for myself. And what I realized is the first thing I would do when I traveled was look for coffee shops or look for restaurants or look for bars. And really, I just was looking for food. I was hunting for where I would eat or grab, a drink or a coffee. And so I think the bridge just was following what I really, really was interested in and what I really was passionate about. And at some point, it wasn't what I thought it was. And food felt familiar. Food felt comforting. It felt like home for me. So it was kind of a natural bridge to get there. And I find a lot of similarities in terms of writing between beauty and food, just because it is, it's still a medium of the senses, right? We're talking
Yep.
about taste, or in some cases with beauty, you're talking about scents for perfume, for example, or fragrances. I like to say that, it's not too different to call out, a Madagascar vanilla from a fragrance in the same way that you would in a dish, calling out some sort of ingredient. So
Sure.
it doesn't feel too foreign, but it was a little bit of a jump.
What are the things about food that inspire you?
Really, everything inspires me. I mean, I think there are things, and I've become more attuned to it now that I'm in this role, but I think there are things that happen every day that I think that could be a food story. And it doesn't necessarily pertain to food immediately, I think that food is just such a central part of our lives and our day to day that I can be inspired by anything and think of food. So in Detroit, for example, we have a really interesting, what's the word I'm looking for? Our energy source is very interesting. So anytime it rains, we get a lot of power outages here. And so this week we've gotten, a few rainy days and a lot of, tens of thousands of people are without power. And so I just was thinking, well, what does that mean for us food wise? What are people doing with the food in their refrigerators when every time it rains, there's a power outage? And so that's a story, right? That's a food story that you wouldn't necessarily think of automatically. So I can be inspired by just about anything.
That's great. That shows you how intensely a beat can be covered, that essentially you're always thinking of
Yeah.
ideas that fit within it. You wrote in your first article for the Free Press, or I think maybe this was one of your first, once you sink your teeth into Detroit, your palate will be forever changed. What are Detroit's food strengths?
Well, I think when I said that, I meant more of, I guess I was being a little hyperbolic, but I just think that Detroit as its own it will change you. And I think it changes me every day. I think being here in Detroit, I have become a person who is a little bit more aware of humanity in ways that, growing up in New York, I didn't have to think about. I think if you pointed to Detroit on a map or Michigan on a map, I'd be like, what's that? Where, when you grow up in New York, you don't have to know anything outside of New York. But I think being here, it's changed me just in that there's such good people and people who are really aware of being kind to others and compassionate toward others. And so I think that's what I was thinking about when I wrote that. But Detroit's food scene, I've been here now for almost 6 years. It really has changed dramatically. It's grown, it's evolved. It's a really beautiful scene. And I have to say, between being from New York and eating out in New York a lot, living in Chicago, which is another huge food city, traveling around the world for most of my life, I really believe that Detroit's food scene can compete with some of the best food cities in the country.
So one of the primary pieces in the package of stories that you sent for Pulitzer consideration was a year in review
Mhm.
of your first year as a food critic for the Free Press, and it became more of a piece about how America overlooks Black women in upscale dining circles. Can you explain what you experienced and just summarize the piece, and then I had a couple of questions related to it.
Sure, yeah. Well, it's interesting because it's not limited to my experience as a restaurant critic. I think I have experienced this sense of not being remembered, not being recognized my entire career. But I think it was most relevant being a restaurant critic because everyone has that perception of the critic that goes into a restaurant anonymous. And there are so many stories that people laugh about when they hear that restaurant critics have had to go in disguise and get dressed up and change their names and use different credit cards just for the sake of trying to stay under the radar and either to have a true dining experience or so that they don't get thrown out of a restaurant. um, but for me, what I noticed, and it was interesting, I went to dinner with the former restaurant critic for the Free Press, who's a good friend of mine now. And we went out to eat, and a diner came up to him and introduced herself and said how grateful she was for him and his work and his words in the paper. And then the restaurant owners came over and they talked to him and they sent over some, compliments of the chefs. And I just thought, man, well, this is I hate to say it bluntly, but like this is a pretty he's a white man. He's a 30-something-year-old white man who probably looks like more people in this room than I do. I'm going to really have to hide myself when I go out to eat. Like, if I'm in this role, they're really going to know exactly who I am. I won't be able to hide. And it turned out I didn't have to do that. I'd go to restaurants and people wouldn't recognize me. The chefs who I had met and interviewed several times in person, presented awards to them for some of the dinner series that we host, I'd still walk into the room without my business cards or without, an award in my hand for them. And they had no idea who I was. I was just another average diner. And so I just kind of yeah, I just kind of shared that observation and questioned, is it me? Is it, is it the fact that I wear my hair curly sometimes and sometimes it's straight, or sometimes I wear it out and sometimes it's in a bun? Is it that I wear my glasses sometimes and sometimes I don't? Is that why people aren't recognizing me because maybe I'm a little bit of a chameleon? Or is it something a little bit more sinister? Is it that traditionally we have revered white men in this position, and you don't see someone like me in that role. And so, therefore, when I walk in the door, I'm unremarkable and I'm not somebody that they would expect to be in the position that I'm in. So, I just kind of explored my own identity, questions and concerns, and also posed that larger question of maybe it's not me, maybe it's something else.
When you write a personal piece like that, I read it and I was like, wow, that must have been an intense one to write. What was the experience of writing it like?
Painful.
Okay.
Painful. Yeah. I mean, I think again, because there are the questions, I have my own questions of maybe it is me, right? And I know that our readers tend to squirm when you talk about race, when you propose that something could be, a result of racism or biases or, some of those issues. When you bring that up, it makes people uncomfortable, and people who don't believe that that's even a possibility, they react really harshly to that. And so, as I'm writing, I'm trying to. I think you write for the comments, and you also write from the experience, and sometimes those two ideas don't align. And I know I could find myself arguing, arguing the commenters' points, arguing my own points, and almost talking myself out of things. But I just decided to write from my experience, pose the questions that I have, and not look back.
That piece was written in December of 2022. Has anything changed in the 6 months since?
Well, it has changed since the Pulitzer announcement or recognition, and since the James Beard recognition. I now am very much recognized, not just by people in the restaurant industry, but I've been stopped on the street. I've gone, to get a drink and had people stop me at the register. I've had lots of people are recognizing me now, which I didn't think about that part when I was
Yep,
writing
gotcha.
it.
So I'm very curious about the mechanics of this. And this goes back to an episode that we did where I talked to a theater critic, Kalundra Smith, and we talked about the mechanics of reviewing plays. And I'm curious, how does one go about reviewing a meal? Like, how many visits? How many people come with you? What are you looking for? How do you take notes? How much of the meal do you eat? What's the process like? All those sorts of things. Can you fill us in?
Sure. So I try to go at least 3 times to a restaurant. Traditionally I'll eat with my husband. Sometimes I'll, switch it up and bring a friend, or if I've, obviously go a few times, I'll try to bring different people. I'll try different pieces of the menu, or like, try to touch all aspects of the menu. So appetizer, entrees, desserts, drinks. If they have wine, a wine list, I'll take a look at. I also try to think about the dishes that they are, the restaurant is known for, or the cuisine that they're trying to represent. I won't go to, let's just say, I don't know, a Chinese restaurant and get some sort of, I don't know, fried chicken dish. I really want to get a dish that's going to be reflective of what they're trying to achieve there. And I'll leave my recorder on when I sit down just to get sort of room tone, to remember what it sounded like, so that I can also just, say little notes into my phone without having to jot things down, get, songs that are playing, really just sort of like atmospheric. And yeah, I think that's kind of the gist of my process.
That's very, very cool. I remember when we talked to Kalundra Smith, she was talking about the detail with which she records the ambiance and the people around her, and just
Mhm.
observing as much as she could, and having the recorder on the whole time certainly allows you to do that. Is there a review that you're particularly proud of?
I think I would say I published one review that I'm only saying that I'm proud of it because it's a little bit out of my comfort zone, but I did publish a review that was sort of negative, just shared my critique of this restaurant in a way that wasn't, a glowing review. And I think I'm proud of it because I really was honest. I really also, gave the benefit of the doubt when I could. I went several times. I think I was able to show different pieces of the restaurant to really sum up the story. It wasn't just about the food, but it was the ambiance. It was, snickering that I'd heard, among the wait staff. It was the larger context of the ownership behind the restaurant. And, some people reached out and said that they were really grateful for the review because it was refreshing to hear an honest take. I think people do appreciate that. So I'd say that's one.
Have you had situations where you've been confronted by people who own or run restaurants?
Oh, for sure. I mean, that one, yeah, that
How do
one.
you handle things like that?
I think that's my thing. In real life, I'm not a very confrontational person at all. And so it is a little scary for me to be honest when I'm not totally happy about something. But I think I just remind myself, you were honest, you told the truth, and you did it in a way that was respectful and not bashing. And so I think when they reach out, I just respond with my truth. That's all I can do.
Imagining the college student that might be listening and thinking about, all right, how do I write a food review? Like, how do I organize what I want to include in it? How would one go about that?
Well, honestly, I mean, and I'm still working on this, but I try not to follow any rules. I think get all of your thoughts